you're young with erectile dysfunction, something's up. If you're older, you know, your body's older, and so naturally things stop working so well. But when you're young, it's like, okay, is it biological? Is it medical? Usually not. So what is it? And then what guys will then do, driven by a complex, dare I say, is then they'll turn towards nofap. And that's getting away from an argument of whether or not we agree with that particular philosophy or lifestyle. It's just something drove you there. It's like, okay. And then what people do is through nofap, or a 90-day reboot as they call it, their erectile dysfunction erectile dysfunction goes away.
God, what's going on?
Welcome back, everybody, to Jung To Live By. Thank you for tuning in once again. Over the last week or so, we've been building somewhat of an impromptu mini-series all about the mother and the anima and development, psychosexual development, that kind of thing. And the response to the last video that we put up was quite staggering. We were all quite impressed with the level of...
Very moved as well, actually, by a lot of the comments. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, it's surprising, actually. Like, don't mean to toot our own horn or anything like that. It's a reflective of the quality of the community, but you don't get comments like that in most places.
No,
even on other psychological channels. But I thought I'd get a little selection of what you guys have been saying. So Johannes Cox said, similar situation here. If it were possible for you guys to make a video going into more detail about going back down to the instinctive level, that would be extremely helpful to me and to others. Joshua Knox has said he's had this same problem and has been speaking for a therapist for the last 3 weeks. But the therapist has basically said there's nothing that can be done. Is this a problem? The answer to that is yes. A guy called Fuck Your Feelings said, I am in such a similar situation. Java Art has said, thank you so much for this video. I am in a very similar situation and I'm also gay. Christian Sather has said it's no joke how much inappropriate behaviour on behalf of the mother can mess up her son. I wonder if we can ever really escape these sticky motherly webs. And Ahmed N has said, as a gay man myself, it's very hard to find any good clinical discussions about the matter, particularly because of the social and legal repercussions.
That's absolutely true.
And obviously you guys were saying in the last video that this stuff is very, very common.
Yeah.
And people don't talk about it.
No,
as,
they don't.
You know, the guys in the audience are like, wait a minute, that sounds a little bit like me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there is a political suppression of this, there's no doubt. And before we had the political suppression, there was more of a cultural one, which was a kind of a cultural unconsciousness over this. And Freud had broken surface tension with it in the late 19th century, along with his colleague Joseph Breuer. And it was suppressed then, and it's being suppressed now. So in that sense, it is a very, very important topic. And over the years, Paul and I certainly, and again, I know I'm repeating myself, over 40 years of experience, we've seen so much of this. And it's a very private and personal experience and a very distressing experience, but it is so common. And it's often latent in the sense that it's in the background of other problems that present. And they're like screens, if you like, which are presented as if that is the problem when it's not. And very often things bottom out into this kind of thing, which is really all about early attachment, because early attachment to caregivers through the parents or whoever's in loco parentis for a child of either sex will help to determine that person's sense of identity in all of its manifold meanings, which includes boundaries, it includes your self-concept, it includes the anticipation that you would hold consciously for how your life will unfold. So many things are affected by early attachment relationships, so it's of vital importance that the people are helped when issues arise around that.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, judging from the comments, you know, we're not the most popular channel in the world,
No.
But there's quite a few of you guys. What can be done about something like this in the absence of, say, a formal therapeutic relationship? Not to endorse any kind of self-analysis, jump into the psyche, psychonaut type stuff, but what is a practical thing someone could do if they suspect that they've been influenced and negatively affected by something like this?
Well, it's very hard, very, very hard indeed, James, to do something or to sort something out for yourself in a vacuum, would you say, Paul? If you believe it's only happened to you and that your frame of self-reference has been shaped by those early experiences, it's actually normal for you. That's the way your life has unfolded. And contradicting that when you suddenly realise, hang on, this has damaged me, it seems so far in the past, so remote. It's very, very difficult, isn't it? Or it seems to be, to bring about change.
Yeah, I think some of it is what you guys have just said, really, which is the inhibition or feeling the inhibition about talking about it at all. Because of the institutional abuse that exists, I mean, that's where you should be able to go for help.
Yeah.
I think we said this on the last podcast, you should be able to go out into the culture and receive the help that you need. And it's only when you realise that those institutions are corrupted and you can't access that help properly that, I mean, that's like being abused all over again.
Yes, it is.
Really.
It is.
And yet the culture, you know, the government in particular, are always putting out messages to say, look, that help is out there, it's available, you know, don't be afraid to come forward, don't be afraid to speak about these things. And yet when you do, you very often met with a very different response to the one that you expect.
Yeah.
So to some extent you're left to fall back to your own devices, and I guess, and some of these guys obviously have commented on this, finding a therapist that's switched on enough to know about these things and to understand the current zeitgeist and the fact that a lot of this has been politicised. It's very, very difficult to access someone who understands in that complete sense what the person coming to see them is up against. I suppose this is why we're feeling the impetus as therapists to talk about this more if we possibly can, and talk about our own practice and how we would tackle some of these things, and hopefully some of that will be helpful to people. It's the only way we feel that we can maybe reach more people. Is to talk about it collectively as a group of therapists and our own experience of things. And we have personal experience of it within the context of our own family, and obviously we have it within the context of our wider work as well. Yeah,
we have. Yeah, really good points. Of course, as you say, Paul, one of the problems of going to a therapist is that the therapist is a human being who has developed, shall we say, within a specific context.
Yes.
That will include a political context these days, sadly.
Yeah.
A lot of therapists, even of the analytical orientation, are very shifted, and I won't say in which direction.
Yeah.
You can find out quite easily if you Google it. Shifted in a certain political direction, which colours pretty much everything that they do, and how they think, and how they approach people. Within the various psychotherapy schools, it's like a Tower of Babel. They all speak a different language, they all think they have the only truth, and therapeutic dogma is placed in the way in between the person who just wants help and the therapist. And you very often get this inculcation of a particular theory or worldview or even a political set of beliefs into somebody who goes to a therapist for help. So in everyday terms, a self-help group, charities, they do an awful lot of good work.
They do.
The awful thing is they shouldn't have to exist, though the fact that they do shows there is something wrong with the way the culture broadly is handling these things.
And they're often underfunded.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll just be I mean, we've known this, a single person at the helm trying to deal with all the you know, the incoming traffic, for want of a better expression, and whilst they may be very well placed to help people, and often they are because they've had this kind of experience in their own background, and experiences of coming up against the institutions and all the difficulties surrounding them, nonetheless there's often not enough people within the charity or within the organisation to help the sheer volume of calls that are coming into them. And,
this is why that you know, we get comments or whatever else saying, you know, why do you critique the archetype so much, or Jung so much, or CBT so much, and it's like, this is why. Because we hit on a topic which clearly resonates with people in terms of their own personal suffering, which isn't just suffering in a moment, it's not acute, it's chronic.
It is.
That's the horrible thing, where you can't get back on your lifespan. It's like, well, that's why we speak out against it, because it's a real, it's a threat, and it's what people will come to when they first want to seek help. It's saturated with swear word.
Yes, indeed. First of all, though, there is hope. There's massive hope, and that's an important thing to get across. we're in an ecology which does not support people who've been abused. Abuse being a very wide category, of course, but the ecology, the cultural ecology does not adequately support that. The therapeutic ecology does not either. But fortunately, there are ways for people to share information and share positive growth potential that they have within themselves and within a group, and they can move forward. There's immense power in people coming together and bringing about positive therapeutic change. There is a shadow side to that, and that is that it can form a group, if you like, of identification and mutual cross-infection psychologically, wherein people actually suppress development because of a few dominant personalities within the group, or perhaps even an ideology that's taken on board. That can be a therapeutic or a political ideology. In effect, they're the same thing, and that can lead to a suppression of growth. Moving away from some of these, you mentioned archetypes, some of these constructs, these therapeutic constructs, is very, very important. I am often put in the place where I appear to criticise Jung, or I actually do openly criticise Jung, and I get criticised for that. Believe me, I wouldn't do it if I wasn't absolutely sure it was necessary in the context of doing it at that time. And one of the reasons why it's necessary is there is so much nonsense out there being pushed around about Jungian ideas that they tend to inflate people away from actual experience of tackling real world problems.
Yes, it's not the collective unconscious, it's what you've actually experienced in your real life.
Yes. Yeah. The collective unconscious is real, and I don't want to get distracted necessarily into that. It's what it is, what it really is, that's important to understand. Otherwise you provide yourself with a fantasy and a means of escape from engagement with real life. Nobody ever comes in and says, I have a problem with this archetype or whatever it is. They come in and they're suffering, they want the suffering to end. And it should be the job of a therapist, and that's my context, it should be the job of a therapist to do everything they can to end suffering. This is primal suffering when someone is abused in such a way that not only is it physical or sexual, it abuses their sense of identity and their capacity to develop and become themselves over their lifespan. That is so fundamentally serious and damaging. That really has to be looked at in its own context. There is a way of solving it. Archetypes should not be your first port of call. Probably actually the last, if you're going to engage with it at all. These archetypes will make some sense at the end of your journey, but you can treat them then for what they are, which are basically just fantasies. The real place where the harm is done is also the place where the cure will be achieved, and that is at the level of instinct. And people don't understand what instincts are generally. There is this prejudice that instincts are animalistic and not human, and that somehow archetypes are transpersonal and spiritual and quasi-religious, or even a replacement for a natural religious expression in our lives. They're not, and I say that as someone who has got 40 years clinical experience, but has got close on 50 years experience of depth psychology in my own life and in the lives of others. I didn't come to this conclusion easily. It's hard won. We've been through a great deal together, as Pauline said, with respect to our own families and things that have happened to one of our own children. We've worked with thousands of people in depth. We know what's important to real people when they suffer, and we know how and what the best ways are to bring yourself out of this kind of awful mess. It is not archetypes, and it is not CBT either. No. People are hurt at the level of feelings, and don't fall for this Jungian idea of thinking versus feeling. All these oppositional, polarized views, they don't lead to anything except stasis and stagnation and rumination. Avoid them completely. Jung said that feelings can have people. He's absolutely right with respect to that. And these injuries are not cognitive. These injuries are at the level of emotion and at the level of instinct and of identity, fundamental identity. If you just simply try to reframe your thinking, you're going to do nothing whatsoever to do with the instincts that have launched these feelings into your consciousness to impel you to do something about the suffering and the pain that you feel so deep it's down at the level of your genome. It's at that level. It's biological. And there's too much rejection of biology in favour of psychological reductionism. Biology is the logos of life, the reasoning of life itself. Why do people reject it? It's absolutely stupid.
Yep.
Biology is
Yep.
your fundament, that's what you come from. And when you die, that's what you decompose through. If you have a spirit and it's released after that, that's absolutely fine, and that's something you can argue about metaphysically. But living is biological. Psychology is a concomitant of biology. It's never separate to it. And when people are hurt with respect to their psychology, you can be absolutely sure that their biology has been affected as well. Instincts serve a purpose. They are goal-directed. They are intelligent, programmed actions of behaviour that our ancestors have gone through. They're about survival, but they're about adaptation. They're whole situations. They include narratives to push you through to completion and getting through serious situations of adaptation in life. We do require another level to modify instinct that gives us plasticity and ability to function widely in response to immediate threats. But if you were only cognitive and had no contact with your instincts and with your emotions, you are going to end up in a mess. And if you then impose a cognitive level of therapy on someone, there will be a dose effect curve which is based on suggestion. That simplistic suggestion will wear off, and it happens time and time again with CBT people, the victims of CBT. They end up going back into the system and recycled, told to think again in another different way, whereas the fundamental issues have not been addressed. And for those of you who are informed about neuropsychoanalysis, and if you're not, I strongly suggest that you should, you will learn that emotions themselves are conscious. It's a separate kind of conscious to our normal consciousness, but it's faster. It's 2 milliseconds faster in terms of processing than the way information is processed in the cortex. Down in the limbic system, down in the base of the brain. That's where things start to happen very, very quickly in terms of forming reactions to traumas and to stress. This is where complexes come from, and this is where our ideas about archetypes come from. The conscious idea we have about the representation of instinct through emotion and an action in culture, that produces these so-called archetypal images. Get down to the level of instinct and emotion and you will sort this out.
Well, Steve, you were saying about the emotions being conscious, but a different type of consciousness.
Yes.
It's very, very strange how we don't know that.
Yes.
And I wouldn't toot my own horn either, because it's one of those things that you kind of know. It's like, well, of course we have emotions for a reason, but we like to think it's primal and pushed away. But Rossi was the one who sort of slapped me into shape with that. I was reading him recently, and he's like, the things that you experience in your body and your emotions are akin to signals from the unconscious, because how else would it signal to you? Well, we know from the Jungian analysis stuff that dreams are like a signal or a message to you from the unconscious for individuation purposes. But so could a headache, so could anxiety, so could a feeling of being scared or a feeling of being sad. It's like, what's wrong with that? It's like, well, therefore you're right, you've got sort of your cognitive side, and then you've got this other side that's equally as valid, that's trying to talk to the cognitive side.
Yeah.
She's like, okay. That immediately gives you so much power to come back, because you've got, in the moment, either watching this video or away, you've got a starting point to be like, how am I feeling?
Yeah. Yeah. For those guys who are used to thinking of the conscious and the unconscious minds in the more usual way, and that's most people, and that's no one's fault or problem as such, the insights gained by neuropsychoanalysis are enlightening, because most of what we regard as being conscious is unconscious, and a lot of what we regard as being unconscious is actually primary consciousness, and the emotions are conscious in and of themselves. But this is a real discovery. This is not theory. This is something which is demonstrable scientifically. Emotions are the primary basic form of consciousness. The way that Professor Mark Solms puts it is that you can't have as such an unconscious feeling. That doesn't mean to say that there are or there are not feelings that are not conscious. In other words, that the unconscious feelings don't exist. It's just that you can't receive that without a form of consciousness. When you are aware of a feeling, it is conscious at that point. The thing is, it's always been conscious, and it becomes conscious with respect to our normal awareness at a point of significance, and it's always when we're being impelled to bring about the proper satisfaction of a need of some kind. This is why we feel an emotional impetus to solve problems out in the environment. We're being impelled to do that. And the emotion itself is delivered by instinct, and the instinct is under the regulation of the genome. Very often on a timed release mechanism because of issues like puberty, which is perhaps the clearest example.
Yep.
But in order to get to grips with how you've been hurt in the past, you have to understand that you were in a particular emotional state and a particular developmental state at the time that that particular trauma first started, and then if it was reinforced, then you have that occurring over a timeline.
Yep.
There is a level of consciousness then which is independent to normal cortical consciousness, which exists before we can think about it, as I mentioned before. And these feelings and instincts imprint a whole body state with respect to the genome as it is at that time, and the anticipation of how you should be treated. So if it's from a caregiver, the anticipation genetically from your genome is that this caregiver will meet your needs properly, and the attachment instinct in you is to bring that about. And under normal conditions, the caregiver should imprint reciprocally upon the child, and then the whole situation is nurtured and cared for properly. The caregiver has all the power. If the caregiver abuses that relationship for whatever reason, then the instincts, which are powering in from the genome, delivering emotions to imprint attachments at a particular time, get affected. This is subcortical, but it's already beginning to build what we would call complexes later on. As that person evolves and develops through puberty and on into adolescence, then that initial impression starts to attract other material to it. The kind of things that we can think about, but perhaps we're not fully conscious of in an ordinary sense. So, I'm sorry if this is too theoretical at this stage.
No, not at all.
But what you need to do then is to reactivate the whole state that was involved at the time when you received that initial impression. Not to go back to being a child, a vulnerable child. Yeah. That is the key distinction. And where a lot of therapists go wrong is that they infantilise people by getting them to reenact childhood in a cognitive way. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to approach it by activating in consciousness a bridge, a connection between who you are now and the state that received the impression that was traumatic or problematical for you. Once you've got that, you can truly reframe the experience at an emotional level, because you're directly communicating with the doorway, the portal to your instincts and therefore your genome. If you approach it only cognitively, hyper-rationally, you'll never get there. If you approach it through fantasy, you won't get there, because fantasy is a distraction. It's a diversion away from direct contact with what is your real unconscious mind. The real collective unconscious includes many things. Instincts, for sure, for all of us. Many, many other categories as well to do with information processing and anticipations about the environment. But instincts are the primary drivers of our behaviour. They have intentionality. And as Jung himself said, archetypes, as he called them, were the self-portrait of instincts, which means instincts create them. And the portrait, by analogy in this case, is an image. There's your archetypal image. And that's something which becomes conscious. Instincts, when they're fully mobilised, are rarely conscious in a normal ego or egocentric way. They just impel us to action. It has to be that way. If we had to think about them cognitively, we'd never get anything done. We get distracted off into diversions. But when you connect with an instinct through emotion, and I don't mean by catharsis or abreaction or freaking out or primal scream or anything like that, I mean the conscious aspect of emotion, you can truly begin to correct for the damage that was done in the past. And this is why I don't believe in re-traumatising people by infantilising them, saying they're an inner child, creating the fantasy of that and directing it back in time, allegedly. You're not touching it. You're not touching the problem. The problem is coded emotionally at the level of instinct and in the genome. That's where you have to go to fix it. There are methods of doing that.
There's so much I want to say on that. But quickly on the inner child, grounded in biology, the idea of an inner child, theoretically, it wouldn't get into any journal ever.
No.
No one would ever take it seriously. It's like, yeah,
No.
you were once a child, but not anymore. Your transcriptomic profile is completely different than when you were a child.
Yes.
It's like, so therefore you're not a child anymore by definition.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about the sort of affect work, if
Yeah.
you like, done it on myself and I've
Yeah.
helped other people through it. It is so powerful.
It is.
Because someone like myself will just bring in typology slightly just for illustrative
Yeah, sure.
purposes.
Sure.
You could say I'm like a walking around floating head. There's been a joke on this channel and with the Carder for a little while now. And you know, I come to you with some kind of issue like, I can't fix this, or this is going wrong, and you're like, feel it, and I'm like, oh well.
Yeah.
And which doesn't work, because if you go straight to your cognitive faculties, you're just asking for complexes to come in and distract you.
Yeah.
And you know this is true because every time you approach a problem which you might have had for years, the solution's different every time.
Yeah.
There's different complexes will tell you a different thing. Well, I should go work more to fix it. Oh well, maybe this book will help me. You just disappear off into la la land.
Yeah.
But the emotion is like, I know the emotional profile will vary from person to person. But when you start to feel that rage come in, or the upset come in, then you change psychophysiologically.
You do.
That all your cognitive faculties are blown out of the water.
Yeah.
You're not conscious in that same sense anymore. It's like you've ducked down into something slightly deeper. That, as an introductory exercise, so powerful.
Yeah,
It
you
really works.
actually lose the capacity at that point to think in that way.
Oh, yeah.
that you've just described.
It's so refreshing as well.
Yeah,
In a weird way.
yeah. But it's interpreting the signal correctly as well.
Yes.
That's coming up, isn't it? That's got to be important that you do that accurately.
Yes.
Yeah. That's why I was saying that don't just have a catharsis or an abreaction, which was the way that Freud and Breuer dealt with traumatic memories from childhood, for example, where there were emotions. There would be a ritual purging, and people feel okay after that, just like, dare I say it, people who suffer from bulimia can feel great after they've thrown up. That's a transitory hormonal response to the discharge of emotion in the moment. But it's not the emotional encoding of the trauma. It's something separate. It's another level of distraction. And it's also potentially damaging, because when you revivify, and you're creating a completely new state through a catharsis or an abreaction, you are open to impression, to suggestion from the outside and internally from your own complexes. And what you may find is you just created more and more layers of distraction.
Are you also saying at that point, or implicitly through your action, that the ego has no purpose in terms of orienting for a problem? So if the ego evolved to do that specific purpose, if you simply give in to emotion and just release emotion, for example, you go into a rage state, so you go and scream at everyone that you ever met to break away, you've sacrificed the actual phylogenetic purpose of the ego at that point.
You would.
So it's a unification between the two.
It is.
If I'm on the right track there.
Yeah, you are. I mean, that's really how Freud conceived of the ego. It had an executive role of adaptation to the outer world. And neuropsychoanalysis, which is an emergent discipline from within affective or emotional neuroscience, the two leading figures will be respectively Professor Mark Solms and the late Professor Jaak Panksepp. They looked at it in that way because it makes absolute sense biologically, it makes sense clinically as well. And Mark Solms, for example, says that consciousness essentially evolved to deal with an extension of homeostasis, which is balance within the body, an extension beyond what the body can do for itself. So it allows you to adapt to the environment with flexibility. That's the purpose in an evolutionary sense of consciousness. Once it evolves further, and it's reached its alleged apex in human beings. But one of the problems with that is that we tend to over-identify with the contents of our immediate consciousness, and we forget that things are imprinted at a different layer. It's emotional. Again, though, making the distinction between emotion as in a catharsis or an abreaction and emotion as in a whole body state. And that whole body, which is Rossi, that you mentioned, Ernest Rossi's work, is involved with that interface between pure psychology and pure biology. It's the interface that crosses Jung's psychoid boundary at the level of instinct and straight into the genome, where there are so many controls in place for gene expression, and then obviously through lifespan development as well. So if you get to that level, if you get to the level of emotional processing and understanding, you'll find that your emotions actually calm down because the pressure on you is reduced immediately. And as soon as you ask yourself the question, what do my instincts want from me? You can ask yourself real questions then. And I don't mean go out and kill people because I want to be possessed by rage and revenge or anything like that. It'll be the instinct to be adapted. The instinct to optimally develop yourself. This is Jung's individuation process. But Jung didn't bring biology in enough. It was psychologized and then put into the realm of myth and fantasy, which are containing vessels for other things, but the real primary drivers are biological. If you ask yourself with all honesty where your real pain is, it's in your adaptation through your lifespan development. Yeah. It's not in a fantasy. It's not the engagement, say, with a computer game, but it's treated as if it is when people start to go on about archetypes and archetypal images. Those things are unnecessary in terms of development and in terms of addressing real issues within yourself.
I'm reminded quickly of, I think this is a decent example for like the whole body state, because it also sums up young men and potentially mother problems, is working with guys with erectile dysfunction. If you're young with erectile dysfunction, something's up. If you're older, you know, your body's older, and so naturally things stop working so well. But when you're young, it's like, okay, is it biological? Is it medical? Usually not. So what is it? And then what guys will then do, driven by a complex, dare I say, is then they'll turn towards nofap. And that's getting away from an argument of whether or not we agree with that particular philosophy or lifestyle. It's just something drove you there. It's like, okay. And then what people do is through nofap, or a 90-day reboot, as they call it, their erectile dysfunction erectile dysfunction goes away, and they can start performing sexually properly again. And it's like, well, therefore pornography caused this through dopaminergic damage or something, where there's no mechanism known whatsoever. So no, you got your sense of masculinity back. That was what happened. And whether or not that's a healthy thing in the long run is a different question. But it's like you've influenced through your psychology, your biology, and to add a slight Jungian splash on top, it's symbolic. Like that's more Freudian even. It comes back.
You've got a mythologizing of dopamine there.
That's true.
Instead of an understanding of what it is, and the creation of imaginary connections, which, as you say, actually feed into other things. Far better to get into the other things and set the distraction aside. Then
it's a misattribution of things, isn't it?
Misattribution,
really?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So on that idea with the nofap and the erectile dysfunction, it's like, okay, what you've got there is a man's inability to properly relate to a woman. Now, it would be very crude to reverse engineer that and say it's caused by an overprotective mother, but it can be caused by an overprotective mother, and that has been some of my experience both with friends and with working on the clinical work. So you find a weird paradox that ends up, which is really sad and keeps people trapped. It's like, so I've had issues potentially with my mother or with something similar in the past that then becomes psychobiological, and by confirmation bias, I end up overamping my masculinity further and further and further. And what you end up doing is, you know, in these communities that I was part of them for years, it's like, well, we need to do our cold showers and our walks and our journaling and our this and working out and everything else. It's like, where's mentioning of talking to women? It actually ends up being pathologized. Semen retention is what they call it, independent of, say, a spiritual framework, which is where something like that would belong. But rather, I'm getting, it's one of the self-development thing to hold back my ejaculation. And it's like, what you can see, if it is caused in specific instances by, say, an overprotective mother, she's won. She's won. And everyone just gives into it.
Yeah.
I don't know what you guys think about that, but that sounds incredibly sinister to me.
Well, I think it absolutely is, and it's in keeping with what you said earlier, Steve, really, about self-help groups of any kind, in so much as often they maintain pathology as well, and sometimes it takes someone to break out of that or break away from that frame in order for other people to see how entrapping it is. And you're right to say, James, that you kind of men seem to do this, don't they? That they almost become a caricature of themselves in an attempt to display their masculinity, and in the process of doing so, they actually lose the very thing that maybe it defines them in that way. And it doesn't, like you say, doesn't solve the problem of relating either, because if men are supposed to create a vessel for themselves in order to receive women, then the kind of rather than being proactive, they're kind of doing it passively. They're kind of trying to shape themselves in such a way that they hope women will then be attracted to them.
I was going to mention that to you,
yeah. But they're not actually doing that. They're actually doing the opposite of that, and that's very sad. It's very, very sad.
It is. It's like when you don't, psychological maturity isn't being built, but it's as if you're tacking other things onto yourself to compensate for that.
Yes.
And I was there once as well, and I've got lots of friends who do that. So there's no like value judgment on those people.
No, sure.
But it's like, I'm not a woman. I never have been a woman, and probably never will be a woman. But I presume a woman would not find that kind of thing optimally attractive. To be like, well, he's on his nofap and his cold showers.
Yes.
I want a bit of him. It'd be other things which would be psychological maturity.
Absolutely.
In the broadest sense.
Yeah. Well, in any relationship, people want engagement, don't they? That's surely what relating is all about, whether it's between men and women or same-sex individuals. It's that feeling that you can connect and you can have rapport to someone, with someone. And we've often said this, Steve, ourselves, haven't we? And we've probably said it to our own son along the way. There are so many ways of being a man.
Yes, so many.
Many authentic ways of being a man, and they don't all involve going to the gym and pumping iron and building yourself up in that way and appearing to be virtuous by repressing, your sexual needs and so on. I mean, it's a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It becomes kind of not sterile. There's another word which probably describes.
I know what you mean, though. Yeah.
But I don't know. It just strikes me as being so devoid of relating, of doing something about something which isn't really the thing in and of itself.
It's symbolic, isn't it?
Yes, it
it's
is
a
symbolic.
Conversion.
Yeah.
A cathexis of libido, as
yes,
Freud
you
would
could
say.
put it that way. Yeah, you could.
And having been in that situation before, if you can actually... I know it appears cognitive at first to be like, this is a good idea to build myself into a strong man. It's not really if you sit in the moment and think about it. It's something is compelling you to do it. And usually the cognitive result of that is I must do it or else I'm not a man. Something like that. Then you're being driven by something else. There's a complex there, that there's an instinct underneath that wants to come through. And if you look at what's happening and what, we obviously talk about the personal myth a lot, it's like, well, the base of that, or the usual deepest layer that you can go to for just general practicality is mating and relating. And it's like, if those things aren't in place, but these other things are, what's driving this? It's another way to sort of get back down into instinct again and be like, okay, wait, what? By his libido or by her libido, ye shall know them.
Yes.
It's like, so why? Where's this interest coming from? And it could well be, obviously, on topic of this conversation, we got off on a little bit of a tangent, but it could well be something like an overprotective mother, or it could be an absent father, or other things that they've experienced.
Yeah.
That's the depth psychology way of doing things.
It is, and that's why we've got all of these theories, really, that have branched off from Freud and Joseph Breuer, who's often forgotten, the Kleinians, and the object relations school. All of this has come from something. It's come from real world observation. We may disagree with some of their conclusions or some of their emphases. We can't eliminate, though, the fact that it's based on real observation of real people. And that's important. And this is one of the drawbacks of Jung, isn't it, Paul? That it gets too abstract, or the interpretation of him is that way. With what James was saying then, about how deep you can go, and this idea of individuation, you get this ego-self axis idea. It's not necessary to think in those terms, and it is a distraction, and it's why Pauline and I, and particularly me on this channel anyway, promote, shall we say, the idea of the genomic self, that it is biological in origin. You cannot separate yourself off from your genome. You have no choice about that. It's what you're born with, and its regulation regulates your psychology fundamentally. Can't escape from it. Your development biologically, anyone would accept, is based on your genome. So why would you separate your psychology off and then put in this other entity, the Jungian self, as this reified thing which manages everything? It doesn't. The so-called Jungian self is a projection of the genomic self, in our view. In other words, it is the same thing, but it's that thing which stands a chance, however difficult, of being perceived within consciousness and experienced as a symbol within the culture. That's what it is. It's a psychological experience of a biological fact which itself interfaces with culture. So when you bring it back down to the logos of life and lifespan as being a biological release of your genome and adaptation, you understand yourself better immediately. You don't have to throw away spirituality. So those people who feel, and Pauline's often discussed this with me and pointed this out, it's as if people think or feel in an inappropriate way that they are dispensing with spirituality by focusing on biology.
Yeah.
They're not at all. What it means is that they're too attached to fantasy. When you can ground yourself in biology, you can authentically move forward. This is why Paul and I talk about Freud first, then Adler, then Jung. So in other words, instincts and biology, then social adaptation, and then you can address Jungian issues, so-called spiritual and transpersonal issues. If you don't deal with your biology, if you don't deal with your social and environmental aspects of life and adaptation, you'll never have a spiritual life, because life will eliminate you way before you get there. And if you're lucky and you somehow navigate your way through to a Jungian level, but you've still got a pile of Freudian and Adlerian issues left behind in your wake, they will come for you. So you need to address them. And remember that a lot of Jungian talk conceals Freudian and Adlerian issues of adaptation.
Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a lady yesterday who is very knowledgeable in all the Jungian ideas. She also has a wider understanding of psychology too, and understands about the model that we use. But nonetheless, she had reduced everything to psychology with respect to understanding and interpreting some of the difficulties that she's been having in her own life. And it was the thing that struck me about it, and I think struck her as well, as she was giving this very sort of lengthy analysis really of her own situation, and I kind of just sat and listened to her patiently for some time, because it almost felt that it was necessary for her to give this exposition. By the end of the session, it was quite clear that it was all irrelevant, and she talked around lots of things. She talked around, and like I say, she's pretty well informed, so she was talking around things like the animus, around transferential issues, about complexes, etc., etc. And at the end of the session, it got down to the fact that, well, she's hit 30. She's in a relationship with somebody. She's not sure whether it's the right relationship for her or not. And the pressure to become a mother, the instinct to become a mother is starting to, it's been making itself known for some time, but it's starting to increase in intensity. And she's a career woman, and all of those things obviously are on her mind as well, and also the relationship to her own mother, but also the complete lack of transmission transgenerationally through the female line for her about what it means to be a mother herself. And her early conditioning was such that she was made to feel that she always had to prove herself, and that she had to go out into the world of work and prove herself as well, and that she had to be competitive with her siblings. And it was as if she has been for a long time, this kind of constant drive state. And you could see from her body language and from the increased emotionalism that she was emotionally and physically exhausted because she was so driven. But at the very heart of that, the very bottom of all of that, was her need to be a mother and to do things her own way. But she had no decent female role models to fall back on through which to draw on, if you like, to be nourished by, that would allow her to release her own potential to become a mother and to do things in her own way. And she said to me at the end of the session, she said, well, I really wasn't expecting that. I wanted to talk to you because I wanted to talk to you about theoretical issues, really. And she had to accept by the end of the session, well, that's the thing. That's where the pressure is coming from for her to actualise that aspect of herself. And she also said, well, I guess that the only way I'm going to solve this problem is in the doing of it. And that might not seem like a lot to say, but that is actually quite a profound thing, because yes, she does have to go through it in order to resolve it. And yes, she will hit up against her mother complex, and it will try and interfere with what she has in mind, and with even just say getting to a point where she gets pregnant, and obviously there will be issues beyond the pregnancy as well. But unless she goes with that and she fulfills the obligation to the genome, she will never resolve it. And it just struck her, I think, in that moment that that's what she has to do. And the difficulties that she's having relating to her partner as well, to some extent, will be resolved as well by allowing herself to go with that process, because he was almost parenting her, and that was pushing her into a particular state where she, in relation to him, she was more of a child. And I had to say to her, well, look, if he's allowed to release his instincts properly, and therefore to father his own children, then the likelihood of him wanting to father you in that kind of almost inappropriate way will probably fall away as well. And so many issues can be resolved by, as I think we're all saying, by tuning into the instincts and finding out what they want from us, and find a way of managing them and managing that process in our everyday lives. And I really hope that, and I do believe she could be a fantastic mother. There's no reason why not. And the going through with that and the living of it, that lived experience, is what ultimately will blow her own mother complex away. And it will be irrelevant at that point. She needs to go out and be a mother, and be a mother on her own terms, in her own way, with her own experiences, and to simply look out for where her mother complex might try and intrude on that. But the more she does it and the more she works on it, the less of an issue it will be. I do believe that. And, like I say, it was a bit of an eye-opener, I think, too, because she hadn't expected that was the thing that was really bothering her.
Yeah, that's a perfect exposition of how practically to look at things from a therapist's point of view, guiding somebody who thinks they have a theoretical problem and has their head full of, in this case, it was probably Jungian ideas.
Yes, it was, yes. It was all animus stuff,
right,
and typological stuff, and
So all the Jungian constructs were there, but getting in the way of her instincts being expressed properly. You can utilise the theory later. It's a luxury when you're comfortable enough to do with it. But right in the raw, when you need to deal with adaptation, you have to go where the adaptation is, or has not been so far in your life. So that was a perfect example. Outside of theoretical rebuttals, which you tend to get from me.
I think the thing that struck me was her own realisation, or the realisation that her psyche provided in that moment of what she needed to do. That was what struck me the most, really, was that suddenly it was summed up for her, the way forward, the way out of it, and it was clear, and it was simple and uncomplicated, and it was you could say it was a kind of spiritual awakening in a way.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But and this is what you've been saying about the instincts, Steve, as being a vehicle to spirituality.
Oh yes, they are.
In a way that people don't fully understand that they can be.
I totally agree with you there, because
it was an awakening.
When you have a truly numinous experience, you're on the side, if you like, and of your instincts, but also of your genome. That's why you get the rush. That's why the emotions pour through, why you feel better emotionally, because your genome, which is watching you all the time, will say, that's it, that's what you want, that's what you need.
Yes, it's what's required of you.
If you then, though, replace that awareness with a whole set of construct ideas, you've lost it. Yeah. You've dropped it. You've dropped the progress you could have made. Yeah. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Thank you for watching this episode of Jung To Live By. If you haven't already, make sure you download our free PDF for integrating your shadow. It includes the most advanced theory on the topic available anywhere on the internet, as well as a full practical breakdown. If you've ever wanted to integrate your shadow, this is honestly the way to do it. Thanks again for watching, and take care.